So I'm going to set this up in the context of climate policy. We often hear this person doesn't believe in climate change or whatever, but what matters, politically anyway, is whether or not we support climate policy. And if you don't support, let's just call it policy X, then you're a denier, right? So as my way to present what I'm hearing from the skeptics, I've created kind of a series of steps representing what you need to accept in order to support policy X. Could be subsidies for renewables, could be cap and trade, could be signing on to the Paris Agreement, whatever it is. So starting with the basics, you have to accept that the Earth has been warming recently. So what does that mean? It means that global average temperature has been on a warming trend over the past few decades. Well, that alone isn't too surprising because it's either warming or cooling at any given point in time, pretty much on any time scale. But we're just getting started here with the basics. Next, you have to accept that man-made CO2 contributes to that warming. So we're saying that carbon dioxide from man's use of fossil fuels has an initial warming impact on the climate system, and therefore it's probably a factor in this recent warming from the first step. Now, at this point, this is just the basic physics you hear about all the time that's been understood for a very long time. Right? CO2 is a greenhouse gas. You increase it, it'll trap more heat. But the word initial is key here, or sometimes it's described as the direct impact. We're going to get to more warming, but the initial impact is this first step. And that's the basic physics. The word mild is here because the basic physics doesn't predict too much. And it's actually a logarithmic effect, according to the science. So you have to work harder and harder. You have to add more CO2 to move the dial at this basic level because that initial impact starts to move towards saturation. So we're still very basic here, but it really starts heating up with the next step. Now this one says that climate feedbacks intensify the initial man-made CO2 warming. And this is key to the case for climate action because this is what really gets you to worrisome levels, or could get you to worrisome levels. This says that the climate system reacts to that initial or direct warming impact of man-made CO2 via various feedbacks in the climate system. And I'm not going to go into the details here, but you have to accept that the net warming effect of those resulting feedbacks triggered by the initial addition of man-made CO2 are larger than the initial effect. So far, so good. Next step, you have to accept, in order to support climate policy X, remember, you have to accept that the net effect after feedbacks is, and will continue to be, significant. What do we mean by that? Well, this means that it's enough to sort of stand out from the background or natural variability. Either the rate or the scale of the warming, or both, really matter compared to all the other things that might be moving the temperature around. And you need to accept that our climate models accurately predict that this significant effect will continue with ongoing production of man-made CO2. So now we not only have warming from the step below, we have warming that matters, and we can predict that it will continue to matter. It's measurable or detectable above the noise. It takes you outside what nature would have done in some significant way. Okay, building on that, you have to accept that there will be significant negative impacts from that warming. And that means negative impacts to human well-being, or maybe to the well-being of the planet as a whole, through such things as extreme weather, sea level rise, crop yields, human conflict, species impacts, etc., etc., etc. So here basically is the parade of terribles that Romm spent 80% of the Harris interview laying out in detail. You have to accept that those are indeed the effect of the warming, and you have to accept that you can accurately predict that those effects will continue or intensify. Right? Because if there's not significant harm, there'd be no need for action. Going further, you have to accept that these negative impacts outweigh any positive impacts. Now, positive impacts aren't talked about very much, but many on the skeptical side point out that man-made CO2 increases in the atmosphere may be beneficial in some ways. For example, the same warming that causes problems may actually cause some benefits. I mean, it can't all be bad, right? There must be some things that are actually better in a warmer future. So those would offset some of the damage, theoretically. There's also a lot of talk in the skeptical world about a fertilizer effect and what's claimed to be a significant, measurable, observed increase in vegetation and crop yields worldwide that's directly attributable to increases in CO2 atmospherically. And then there's the direct benefits we get from the cheap and reliable energy we get from fossil fuels, which are the source of that CO2. So whatever negative predictions you have on one side of the scale, there's something to put on the other side of the scale. And what this step is saying is that you end up with a net negative. Because obviously, if the impacts were net positive, you wouldn't want to take action. or if it was neutral, it wouldn't be worth taking action. So maybe these positive benefits are all BS. I'm not endorsing any of this. I'm just saying that if you want to support climate policy X, generally, it's because you see the future warming built up from these steps so far, and you see that warming as having net negative impacts. Now, you also have to accept, when it comes to most policies at least, this next step, which is that alternative energy is feasible and workable. That these technologies are well within our reach and make it feasible to greatly reduce or even eliminate fossil fuel use without offsetting negative impacts to man or the planet as a whole. And any shortcomings of those technologies are manageable. Right? Romm spent a lot of time on this in the podcast. And if you can accept all this, and it's clear that many people do, this isn't meant to be a straw man here. I think this is all basic mainstream stuff. But you also have to accept that anything meaningful can still be done. That action taken at this point in time can still generate meaningful results. In other words, it's not too late to have a meaningful impact. So this is just to say that the amount of attainable reduction in fossil fuel use via alternative energy or reductions in energy usage or whatever Policy X is about is enough to significantly alter the predicted future impacts in a net positive direction. You can move them to be less negative than they're predicted to be. Right? Or else, again, what's the point? And finally, you have to accept, we're talking about Policy X after all, and I think this is important, you have to accept that Policy X itself is, all in all, taken as a whole package, a good idea, or a good solution to everything we've built up to. Meaning that this specific policy would result in a net positive impact on our future without significant offsetting economic and other negative effects that are worse than the problem we're solving. Now again, this is not meant to be a straw man. I haven't structured this in this way to argue against any of these points myself. Obviously, this is imperfect, and it could be structured a lot of ways. But my point in doing this is to show that there are a lot of levels, a lot to question, and particularly a lot of things that are questioned by the skeptics out there. And this is very important when we talk about consensus. So I'm finally going to get to that 97% thing. Now, the frequent implication is that there's scientific consensus each and every step of the way here. In other words, if you question Policy X, the Paris Accord, cap and trade, some alternative energy subsidy, whatever it is, the implication is that by disagreeing with that policy, you're disagreeing with 97% of climate scientists. Well, according to the skeptics, and as far as I can tell, they're right on this, there is no consensus at all here, 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 or even here. The 97%, as far as anything I've seen, is somewhere in here. Now, if that's true, then it really is misleading to throw that 97% figure around the way that Romm does in the podcast, and actually Sam Harris does as well.